Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 129 called Byzantium, the Slow Road to Recovery. In today's episode, I'd like to switch from the Abbasid Caliphate to the Byzantine Empire. The fortunes of both were, of course, connected, and the Caliphate's decline during the 9th century created an opportunity for Byzantium. But it wasn't an easy path for the Byzantines, and there were some serious setbacks in the first half of the 9th century. Nevertheless, ultimately, Byzantium would emerge once again as the strongest power in Western Eurasia, which was a truly remarkable achievement. So let's pick up where we ended back in episode 126 with the overthrow of the Empress Irene in 802. You'll recall that her reign had plunged Byzantium back into a period of darkness and defeat after the Isaurian emperors had saved it from the onslaughts of the Umayyad Caliphate. Her finance minister Nicephorus deposed her, and he was widely seen as a safe pair of hands. He was first and foremost an experienced and practical administrator, and he left his mark on Byzantine history as something of a Byzantine equivalent to the Roman Emperor Diocletian in reforming administration, tax, and the army. These reforms are still somewhat obscure and subject to scholarly debate, but what is certain is that he reorganised the themes into units of both military and civil administration. Originally, as discussed in episode 124, the themes were military provinces, reflecting where the Roman field armies were stationed to resist the Arab invasion of Anatolia after the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. For the first time, Nicephorus combined military and civil administration under one person, the general or strategos in charge of the theme. Henceforth, the themes would be the main administrative units of the Byzantine Empire. Why did he make this change? Well, it was really intended to make it easier to raise taxes and recruit soldiers, which were, of course, the essential functions of every state in the Dark Ages. The most convincing thesis is that he required the descendants of the Roman field armies, who still formed a powerful cavalry force, to register for military service or commute it in exchange for a cash payment. In 807, a census was collated for this purpose. The soldiers had to sign a register, and their families were required to equip a horseman with equipment worth 18.5 numismata per soldier. Although we have almost no details about how this was actually implemented, it seems to be the first time that soldiers were essentially conscripted to defend their land. Not surprisingly, it aroused opposition, as shown, for example, in the chronicler Theophanes' criticism of it as an evil deed. But it may well have succeeded in increasing the size of the army, as shown by the growing success of Byzantine arms during the 9th century. Second, in order to repopulate and strengthen the defence of the empire's western themes, he moved entire settlements of Anatolian peasants to these regions. Third, he seems to have raised taxes by abolishing some of the tax exemptions granted by Irene to bolster her own popularity. This was pretty straightforward, but of course it aroused opposition from those now forced to pay more tax, especially the church, which caused the monk Theophanes, who's our main chronicler of this period, to rail against Nicephorus. Nicephorus was a better administrator than soldier, but he still tried hard to restore Byzantine dominance on the battlefield. Initially, his efforts were directed against the famous Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, he asked him to repay the tribute Irene had paid. Harun gave him a short answer, and to rebuke his impudence, he invaded Anatolia, defeated Nicephorus, and required him to pay tribute once again, although at a reduced rate compared with Irene. In 809, Nicephorus got lucky with Harun's death and the subsequent civil war that broke out between his sons, which distracted the Abbasids from fighting Byzantium for the next 20 years. It gave him the opportunity to focus on strengthening Byzantium's position in the Balkans, which was under serious threat from the growing power of the Bulgar Khagan, Krum. As mentioned, to counter the Bulgars, Nicephorus had transferred peasant populations from Anatolia to repopulate Thrace, and in 809 a Byzantine army retook the provincial capital of Dacia, which is Serdica, or modern Sofia. Things seemed to be going reasonably well for the Byzantines, and in 811 he moved thematic troops to the west and embarked on what he hoped would be a knockout blow to Krum. He defeated the Bulgars twice and captured their capital at Pliska, where he found Bulgar treasure and allegedly drank the Khagan's wine and burned his palace. But catastrophe quickly followed these successes. As his army was marching through the Varbitsa Pass on its way to Serdica, the advance guard reported the way ahead was blocked by a palisade. Nicephorus didn't reconnoitre this properly and failed to spot the Bulgars were leading him into a trap. He refused to retreat and instead set up camp in the pass. This proved a fatal mistake. The Bulgars commanded the heights, and at dawn on the 26th of July they swarmed down upon the Byzantines, most of whom were still asleep in their tents. The result was carnage. The Byzantine troops panicked and fled, but they found their way blocked by a river and further palisades which concealed a cliff edge. Many were driven into the river, which was too deep to ford, and they were swept away or drowned. Or they crossed the palisades, where they plunged over the cliffs to their deaths. It was one of the worst military catastrophes ever suffered by Byzantium, similar to other great defeats going back to Roman days, such as the Battle of Adrianople in 378, when much of the Eastern Roman army, including the Emperor Valens, had been killed by the Goths. This time, in 811, the casualty list was as extensive as that at Adrianople. Nicephorus was killed, along with most of the Byzantine high command, including the strategoi of the largest themes, the Anatolikon and Thrace, the commanders of two elite regiments of the Tagmata, the Excubitors and the Vigla, and most of the rank and file in the army, which historians estimate to have been around 20,000 strong. Krum celebrated by decapitating Nicephorus and making his skull into a drinking vessel lined with silver. It took a long time for Byzantium to recover from this defeat, but two things meant it wasn't fatal, as the Battle of Adrianople had been for the Roman Empire. The first was that Krum failed to follow up effectively on his triumph. The second was that the Abbasid Caliphate went into decline. Let's look at both of these in more detail. Despite his grisly treatment of Nicephorus's head, Krum seems to have been as surprised about his victory as the Byzantines were. His actions reveal he was no disciple of Attila the Hun, intent on destroying the Roman Empire. Although the Byzantine defences in Thrace collapsed, with most of the fortresses simply abandoned, and we have a long list of them, including Anchialos, Beroia, Nicaea, Probaton, Philippopolis and Philippi, Krum surprised the Byzantines by offering remarkably generous peace terms, which included restoring the frontier to what it had been in exchange for an annual tribute of clothing and dyed skins, worth the comparatively small sum of £100 of gold. The new Emperor Leo V, who was chosen by the army since he was a soldier in charge of the Anatolikon theme, in preference to Nicephorus's initial successor, his brother-in-law Michael I, eagerly accepted the truce. It was followed by another piece of good luck, just as Krum was realizing he'd set his sights too low and was contemplating an attack on Constantinople. He died unexpectedly in his sleep of a brain hemorrhage. This happened in April 814, 2 months after Charlemagne died at Aachen. 5 years previously, in 809, Harun al-Rashid had also died. So within the space of 5 years, Byzantium's principal opponents had all died, and their successors proved much less troublesome. Leo V was also a capable emperor. In 816, he led a Byzantine army back into Thrace and scored a victory over a Bulgar force at Mesembria by ambushing them. It was hardly a game changer, but he celebrated it with a triumphal procession in Constantinople, and it persuaded Krum's successor, the new Khagan Omotag, to agree to restore the frontier to what it had been before Nicephorus's catastrophic defeat. As evidence of their low ambitions, the Bulgars built an 80-mile-long line of earthworks called the Erkesia, or the Great Fence, across the Thracian peninsula, traces of which can still be seen today, to protect them from Byzantine attack. Omotag's treaty ensured 30 years of peace, after which the next major event was the Khagan Boris's conversion to Christianity in 865. There's a long and complex history behind this, in which the Pope competed with the Patriarch to convert Boris to Catholicism rather than Orthodoxy, but the Byzantines got their way, and Boris chose Orthodoxy. He also secured the Bulgarian Church's independence from Byzantium and its right to appoint the Archbishop of Bulgaria. Why did he convert? Well, the Bulgars were originally a Turkic people with the same gods and practices as the Huns, but they were being absorbed into an overwhelmingly Slavonic and Christian population. Consequently, their values were increasingly questioned. Boris may not have liked all aspects of Christianity. For example, our sources say he objected to being limited to only one wife, but nevertheless he saw the political need to convert, similar to what Clovis had done with the Franks back in the late 5th century. He is now revered as a saint in the Orthodox Church. But it's important to stress that although the Bulgars were absorbed into the Orthodox Church, they weren't absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Indeed, they were now established more than ever before as a separate and rival power to Byzantium. And that power was still growing, as shown by their westwards expansion and domination of the Slavonic tribes, with only the Serbs staying independent. Indeed, by the late 9th century, their state was very large, occupying most of the Balkans, stretching from the Black Sea almost to the Adriatic, leaving Byzantium with just the European territory occupied today by modern Greece and Turkey. But as Bulgaria grew ever stronger, Byzantium could at least rejoice at the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Byzantines no longer had to face the horrifying power of the Umayyad armies. Nevertheless, in the mid-9th century, the Abbasids recovered their mojo to some extent under the Caliph al-Mutasim, who responded to a Byzantine campaign against the Arab stronghold of Melitene in 838 by leading a substantial force, including his new Turkish mercenaries, deep into Anatolia, sacking Ankara, whose inhabitants wisely fled, and then besieging the important Byzantine city of Amorium. The Arab chronicler al-Tabari has left us a detailed description of this siege. Despite heavy bombardment from the Arab mangonels, the walls resisted all attacks until a Byzantine soldier treacherously let the Arabs in. The result was the wholesale slaughter of the garrison and population, including the strategos of the Anatolikon theme. Amorium was a major Byzantine city, and this was a serious blow for Byzantium. But Byzantium's conflict with Islam wasn't confined to just Anatolia. The most dangerous threat was in fact in the Mediterranean, when Arab pirates occupied first Crete in 826 and then Sicily in 827. These renegades worked independently of the Abbasid Caliph. The ones who took Crete were led by Abu Hafs, a refugee expelled from the Umayyad Emirate in Cordoba, and Sicily was lost to an expeditionary force from the Aghlabid Emirate in North Africa. The consequences of the loss of these two islands was exceptionally serious for Byzantium. Crete was the gateway to the Aegean, and now the entire Aegean coastline and the many islands became prey to Arab raids. The Emperor Michael II, who reigned from 820 to 829, sent two expeditions to recover Crete, both of which failed. Meanwhile, Sicily became a war zone, with the Arabs occupying the western half of the island and basing themselves at Palermo, while the Byzantines clung on to the eastern half, based in Syracuse. Sicily had been one of Byzantium's most prosperous provinces, fertile and hitherto undamaged, and it was now devastated, like much of Anatolia and Thrace had been. Nevertheless, the turnaround in Byzantium's war against Islam started to get going when the Abbasid Caliphate disintegrated into total chaos during the so-called Anarchy of Samarra between 861 to 870, when four different caliphs were successively appointed and murdered by their Turkish mercenaries. During this time, Syria and Iraq, the heartland of the caliphates, broke up into several self-governing emirates. This made it easier for the Byzantines to deal with them one by one, rather than to face the concentrated power of the caliphate. Nevertheless, some of the emirates were controlled by capable emirs who kept the Byzantines on the defensive. One such was Umar, the emir of Malatia in Arabic, or Melatine in Greek, who made regular raids into Byzantine territory, culminating in a devastating raid in 860, when he crossed Anatolia and returned with thousands of captives and livestock. In the same year, Atalia, which is modern Antalya, the Byzantine navy's main port in the eastern Mediterranean, was sacked by an Arab fleet from Syria. So the year 860 was a dreadful one for Byzantium, but it was to be the last of its kind. For in 863, when Umar again headed into Byzantine territory, he was cornered by the Byzantine general Petronas, commanding a vast army comprising the 4 tagmata and 9 thematic armies, who trapped him beside the Halis River close to Ankara on the central Anatolian plateau. Umar's entire army was wiped out, and Umar was killed. A few weeks later, another important frontier emir was killed. There were wild celebrations in Constantinople. It was a turning point. For the next 100 years, the Byzantines would gradually drive the Arabs back into Syria and reverse the path of conquest taken by Muhammad's armies in the first phase of Arab expansion in the 630s. This had a direct influence, in my opinion, on the Byzantines' resolution of the great religious controversy of this age, the icon controversy. Although Irene had reinstated icon worship, the Bulgar and Arab victories in the early years of the 9th century had convinced many this was an error. Iconoclasm came back into favour, and the iconoclast emperors Leo III and Constantine V were hailed as Byzantium's saviours. In 813, after Nicephorus's catastrophic defeat at the Varbitsa Pass, Constantine V's tomb was opened and his skeleton was called on to come forth and save the Republic. In 815, the Emperor Leo V replaced Nicholas, the iconophile patriarch, with an iconoclast called Cassiteras, who restored Constantine V's ban on icons promulgated at Hieria. The iconoclast claimed this resulted in victory against the Bulgars in 816 at Mesembria, as I mentioned. But the iconophiles were still a powerful faction in the church, especially in the monasteries, and it wasn't long before they hit back. This happened when the Emperor Theophilus died in 842, leaving a 2-year-old son to be looked after by his mother Theodora. The story goes that Theodora was a fervent iconophile, but the more likely truth is that the sack of Amorium in 838 discredited the iconoclasts. With a politically vulnerable woman as regent for her young son, the iconophiles saw their chance, and in 843 Theoctistos, the wily eunuch who was co-regent with Theodora and an iconophile, persuaded her to call a synod to approve the worship of icons in a document called the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which is still read out today in the Orthodox Church on the first Sunday of Lent. In previous episodes, I've suggested most religious disputes in the Roman and Byzantine empires were more about power politics than religion. But I think the icon controversy was a bit different because it seems to have reflected the psychological trauma suffered by the Byzantines because of the rise of Islam. The key question it appears to have addressed was, why had God favoured Muhammad over the pious Byzantines? Icons presented a neat answer. God favoured those who didn't worship icons like the Muslims. So the corollary was to banish icons and win victories. Certainly this was the view in the army. But what made iconoclasm less controversial after Byzantium's great victory in 863 over Umar was that Islam was being defeated, icons or no icons. In the second half of the 9th century, the icon controversy became redundant. And the emperors who took the credit for Byzantium's resurgence against Islam are called the Macedonians. This was because the founder of the dynasty, Basil I, came from a peasant family in Macedonia. His story is one of rags to riches that could come straight out of any work of fiction. Born in around 811, as a young man he gained a reputation because of his exceptional physical strength and sultry good looks, described by a chronicler as, quote, most outstanding in bodily form and heavily set. His eyebrows grew together, he had large eyes and a broad chest, and a rather downcast expression, end quote. He took a job as a groom for a friend of the Emperor Michael III's uncle, Caesar Bardas. It was there that he met the Emperor Michael III, who took a strong liking to him. Basil's rise to power has long been a subject of fascination, since it contains a heady mix of murder and sexual intrigue. The story begins when Michael III fell under Basil's spell. He made him his head groom, possibly after Basil had murdered the incumbent. He seems to have admired Basil for his wrestling abilities and his horsemanship. We know Michael was particularly interested in equestrianism, especially hunting and chariot racing, so perhaps that wasn't too surprising. Historians have spent more time speculating about Michael's sexual preferences, with many suggesting he was a homosexual and attracted to Basil. This may well have been the case, but he was officially married to Eudokia de Capilatissa, although the marriage was childless. However, Michael was also having an affair with another Eudokia by the surname of Ingarina, the daughter of a Viking mercenary, suggesting he was interested in women. This gave rise to a very unusual arrangement with Basil. Unable for political reasons to divorce his wife, Michael told Basil to marry Ingarina while he continued his affair with her. In exchange, he encouraged Basil to have an affair with his sister, Thecla. Michael lavished honours on Basil, making him his chief minister, and then in 866 he took the unprecedented step of making him co-emperor. Meanwhile, Basil continued on his murderous path of self-advancement, murdering first Michael's uncle Bardas, who was a political rival, and then in 867 murdering Michael himself when he was unconscious from a drinking bout. Basil's path to the top involved such a hideous succession of murders that you might wonder whether he was mentally disturbed. But perhaps that's what you needed to be if you were a Byzantine emperor, since when he became emperor, he proved competent and diligent. The even greater surprise was that his new dynasty, the Macedonians, would take Byzantium to a new high when it would roll back Islam's conquests and even threaten to restore the Roman Empire. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, in 2 weeks' time, on the 14th of February, we'll continue with Byzantium and its recovery against Islam. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.